Hi there, my name is Mark Liebman. I'm a retired Navy captain and naval aviator, and I'm also a historian and novelist. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the evolution of the U.S. Navy fighter cockpit. However, as we get into this, you'll see that it's pretty similar to other cockpits, but because of wanting to limit the scope, I essentially stuck with Navy airplanes. So what started this all off is I got a chance to sit in the F-35 cockpit and was struck by how comfortable it felt, and it felt very, very familiar. And we as military aviators owe a lot to the people who came before us, particularly those in the 1920s and 1930s. And I also spent 4 or 5 years as a docent and working on the restoration team at the Cavanaugh Flight Museum, which unfortunately is shut down, and had the opportunity to sit in the cockpits of Russian, German, British, and U.S. aircraft from World War II, and even earlier, World War I, and obviously post-war. And while they all have sticks and rudders, they all are different in detail, and you can see the generations. So that's kind of what I'm going to cover in this presentation. So how did I come up with the criteria of picking the airplanes that are going to be discussed? Well, number one, I started with Navy. Again, this is all done to narrow down the list. They're all flown as fighters, single seat, which unfortunately eliminates the F-4 Phantom and the F-14 Tomcat. Were produced in relative large quantities given at the time they were built. They were the primary U.S. fighters or pursuit aircraft for the Navy. And there's something new in the cockpit in each of the generation that wasn't there prior to this. So we're going to start with the first airplane that was designed for the United States Navy to operate off aircraft carriers. It's called a Curtiss TS-1. It was designed and built by the Naval Air Factory. So it was basically designed and built by the Navy. Wasn't very big, wasn't very fast. But for the time, it was I'll use the word loosely, hot airplane. And they built 46 of them. And they were all operated off the USS Langley, which is the first U.S. carrier. And they began to learn how to operate aircraft off ships back in the early 1920s. So unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures of a TS-1 cockpit, but I thought I would show you this picture because it epitomizes what happens in the next generation. And if you see down at the bottom, there's the arrow pointing to a bunch of little hooks. And the way the airplanes came to a stop on the Langley in the early days is there was a series of wires actually in a grid pattern across the flight deck. They landed, hopefully these little hooks would catch onto a wire and the airplane would come to a stop. Now, in this case, you can see that it kind of came to a stop and crunched the wing, and the Navy began looking at better alternatives for stopping the airplane. Now, it wasn't just the U.S. Navy. The Japanese were playing around with this at the same time, as well as the country that had probably the lead, which was the Royal Navy. So this is an F-4B-4, and it's the first U.S. Navy fighter that had a tailhook, and you can see it hanging on the back. This happens to be one of the neat things the Navy did, was put the airplanes on these little tracks, or the tail wheel little track, to get it off the side of the ship. So the only part that was on the flight deck was the main mount. Now, this is a pretty cool looking airplane. I built lots of models of these things when I was a kid, flying models mostly. It was in service in the mid to late 1930s. It was faster. It had this new thing called a 2-position adjustable pitch propeller, and it had a bigger radial engine. So again, finding a good indication of the cockpit of what one looked like was a little different. And I found one in a museum in Thailand, of all places. Now, the F-4B-4 and the Boeing P-12 fighter for the Air Force were pretty much the same airplanes, except one had a radial engine, the Navy one. The Air Force one had an inline water-cooled one. But the cockpit was the same. And you can see at the front, there's just a few instruments. To the left and right of the instrument panel, there are the butts, or the handles of the 2 forward-firing machine guns. So you could be able to charge them from the cockpit. And in the ones in Thailand, there was this little lever to the right side of the cockpit that wasn't connected to anything. Well, in the Navy F-4B-4s, that's where the tailhook was raised or lowered. So the next generation, it's the Grumman F-3F. This is probably one of my favorite biplane fighters. It kind of looks like a Wildcat with 2 wings. Again, we built a fair number of them. It was much faster because it had retractable landing gear. It had a bigger engine, and it had this thing called a constant speed propeller, which meant that you could set the RPM and advance the throttle forward or back to increase the amount of power the engine is delivered, i.e. the thrust. And you could set the RPM from coarse pitch to fine pitch. Fine pitch gives you more RPM. Coarse pitch gives you less RPM, but a bigger bite out of the air. So the cockpit is, again, different. And there are 3 new things. Number 1, on the left side, you can see the crank to raise and lower the landing gear. And then you can see this knob to the left, this black knob. It's a vernier type thing to change the pitch of the propeller. And there's a thing to the lower right side of the cockpit called an attitude gyro, because by now the Navy is starting to fly in bad weather, longer distances over water, flying at night. And if you've ever flown over water at night, you'll know that there's not much of a horizon generally. And the way I tell people what it's like to fly at night when there's no ambient light is to go into your closet, put towels around the bottom of the door, and then turn the lights out and wrap a towel around your head so you're blinded, and now you get an idea of a well-lit night at sea. Now there's things called commander's moons, which gives you a lot more ambient light, but an attitude gyro on an altimeter is pretty important when you're flying at night over sea. So the next generation is the Grumman F4F. Now I picked the Dash 4 for reasons you're going to see in a few seconds, but again, now you've got retractable landing gear, you've got a constant speed propeller, the airplane's a lot faster, 100 and some odd knots faster, bigger engine, and we built a bunch of these things. They were in service from 1940 to 1945. It was the Navy's primary fighter during the early days of World War II. And if you want to, I did a presentation called Wildcat versus Zero, and dispelling the myth that the Zero was a far superior fighter. It was not. But you can listen to that presentation and the rationale as to why the kill ratio between the Wildcat and the Zero was well in favor of the Wildcat. Anyway, so in the cockpit, you didn't quite have a lever to do this, but you had something on the checklist. And it was basically check to make sure the wings were spread. And the way they're spread on the Wildcat is the ground crew would go out, pull down this lever that you can see here from the drawing from the pilot operating handbook, and they would then unscrew the wings with a bolt, and then they could pivot the wings 90 degrees and fold them back and attach them with a little bar to the tail of the airplane. It was done manually. But when the checklist is, one of the items was when you spread the wings, if the wings were not locked in place, you could see this little red piece of metal sticking up from the leading edge of the wing. From the cockpit, it's pretty noticeable. And if you can't see it, it means the wings are locked. If you can see it, you need to get them locked. So the next airplane, again, a Navy fighter. This is probably my favorite of all times. It's the F4U Corsair. Bigger, faster. We made a bunch of these things. It was in service in the 1950s by the Navy and other countries several years afterwards. And it was a bigger, heavier fighter, but in the cockpit, now notice it's a lot more complicated. There's another thing. It's the hydraulic wing fold. The F6F Hellcat and the Grumman TBM Avenger and the Corsair all had hydraulic folding wings. And so there was a lever in the cockpit. And so what you now start to see on the left side of the cockpit, and this is right out of the operating handbook, is what we call a throttle quadrant. It has the throttle, push it forward, you go faster, pull it back, you go slower. It has a prop control, which controls the RPM that you're using in the prop, and a thing called a mixture lever, which is how much gas the engine is getting. So that throttle quadrant, as you see it now, first appeared in the F4U and also in the Hellcat. Now, the reason I use the Corsair is because the Corsair flew its first combat missions in February 1943, and the Hellcat not until later in the year in September. So technically, it was first. But again, you're starting to see this interesting layout on the left side. There's trim wheels over there for both the elevator and the rudder and the ailerons, and there's just a bunch more stuff in the cockpit. And the instrument panel was a bit different. So what you see here, and again, this is from the F4U's operating handbook, is you can see the beginnings of what we call the T layout. In this case, the RMI, or the directional gyro, is directly in front of the pilot, or pilot's eyes in the center, and you see the attitude gyro right next to it, and a wet compass to the left side, and below that's the needle ball. You got rate of climb, you got airspeed, manifold pressure, engine RPM, literally all in front of you. Makes it easy to see, easy to scan, easier to fly on instruments. Later, you'll see that the attitude gyro moves to the center, but this is the Corsair, and again, it's the evolution of the cockpit. So we're going to jump a few generations. We're going to skip the early jets that the Navy had, mainly because there wasn't anything really new in the cockpit, other than the fact that the throttle quadrant was a lot different. You had it basically pushed forward, the engine, you went faster, you pulled back, you went slower. You didn't have a prop control, you didn't have a mixture control. Everything was done through the throttle to the fuel control of the engine. So here's the F8. When I got my wings, this is the hottest thing in the world, other than the F4 Phantom. Some people call it the last of the gunfighters. This is an early model F8, but they all kind of look the same. So there were some other odd things in the F8 cockpit. So the first thing that you notice is the little radar screen right in front of you. It's the first Navy fighter with an onboard air intercept radar. And you had an ordnance panel that dropped down between your legs. And there's a lot more stuff on the instrument panel. You can see if you have watching this on a screen, you can blow up the list of all the instruments. Again, this came out of what's now known as the Navy's NATOPS manual, the F8 NATOPS manual. NATOPS, for those who don't know, stands for Naval Aviation Training Operations and Standardization. It's a program that began before I became a naval aviator to standardize the way the flight manuals are done, and also training and qualification procedures, and also, amazing enough, improve safety. So again, you can see a whole lot more stuff. Right below the radar is the attitude gyro, and it's large. And airspeed, rate of climb, and all the other good stuff you need is right there, along with all the stuff for the instruments, for the engine instruments, I mean. Then on the left side, you're getting to start to see kind of the way the cockpits are today, where on the left side you got a lot of system stuff, and you can see the throttle, you can see the wing incidence handle. I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's also something that we started using before the Corsair, but it's noticeable there's the throttle catapult handle. And what that is that when you advance the throttle while you're still on the catapult, you take your hand and you grab this handle, and you have the top of the throttle right here, so that when the catapult stroke fires and you get shoved back in the seat, your hand doesn't come back with the throttle, which means you now, instead of at full throttle and afterburner, you're now at idle. Not a good place to be if you're going off the end of a boat. So the idea that the grab handle is up there, hold this, the bar, have the throttles right there. Most pilots will tighten the friction down to make it harder to move, and then you signal the catapult officer and away you go. Then the speed brakes are on your thumb, and it's right on the side of the throttle, so you can push it back and forth to extend or reduce them. And then the F8, because of its aerodynamic characteristics, so if you come aboard the boat with the wing in its normal position, flying position, the airplane would be really cocked up. So to get the nose down to improve visibility for the pilot, some bright bulb at Vought said, hey, why don't we just raise the wing, and then the wing will be at the right angle of attack and the nose will be down lower. So that's the wing incident handling. So that's why you see the wing in the F8 raised, particularly if you see it head on coming aboard a boat. You can see the part of the fuselage, and the wing is up like this, the nose is hanging down, and you're basically landing the airplane. So that was another thing that was kind of odd, and one of the reasons why I picked the F8. Then on the right side, there's some other things on here, like the wing fold lever, and also the raising and lower the tail hook. The symbology has changed, so that now in Navy airplanes, the landing gear lever has a little round thing, looks like a wheel. It's been there since I started flying in the 1968 in the T-34. And the flap handle looks like a flap. the tail hook looks like a tail hook, and you start seeing these things. And so there's a TACAN, which for those who don't know is like a VOR DME. It's the Navy, the military's version of it. The F-8 only had one radio, which was the UHF, and then the IFF is on the back end of it. But again, it's all on the right side, and then it's all relatively grouped to lever. There's other things on there, the light controls for the cockpit and some other things. Again, this is right out of the NATOPS manual, so you can study it if you wish. I'm going to skip 2 generations, which is the F-4 and the F-14, mainly because they were 2-seat airplanes, and the air intercept mission was divided between the pilot and the radar, what the Navy called at those days the radar intercept officer. Now they're known as WISOs, Weapon Systems Officer, and the 2-seat F-18s. But this is an F-18A or B. Well, it's an A because it's a single seat. You can see that we're still building them and buying them. They only made 380 of them. We're now in the E and the F. We went through the C and the D, which my son flew, and we're now in the E's and the F's. But the basic layout is pretty much the same, only that the cockpit has gotten even more advanced. But I'm going to use the A and the B cockpit because this is the first one that had this thing called a head-up display. And this is actually from an Australian publication based on the F-18As that the Royal Australian Air Force bought. But you can see this is the first all-glass cockpit. And the backup instruments are down there in the lower right corner. Those are the ones that people of my generation recognize. But with a head-up display, if you've never flown one or driven a car with one, means that you don't have to look down into the cockpit. You can do all the flying information, the basic flight instrument, airspeed, altitude, rate of climb, information on targeting, all that kind of good stuff, heading, all that stuff is on the HUD right there in front of you. Now the F-18 has these other monitors to do other things, weapons, systems, navigation, all that stuff if you want to look down. But theoretically, the idea was that you could fly the airplane from the time you shoved the throttles forward to the time you landed and not really ever have to look down in the cockpit. So there was another part to this, and it was called HOTAS, hands on throttle and stick. So again, this is right out of the F-18 A and B NATOPS manual. So on the left side is the throttles. You can see all the little buttons there. For somebody my generation who fumbles around with iPhones and doesn't play video games, there's a lot of things going on for your left hand. On the right hand, you got a whole bunch of other stuff. And again, you can see on the stick, all the things that you need to fly the airplane and fight the airplane are literally at hand. So the idea with the head-up display is you can select weapons, fire weapons, talk, navigate, change frequencies, all that kind of good stuff, and not look down into the cockpit. Which brings me to the Lockheed F-35C. And again, this is the Navy version. It's about 30% bigger than the A models that the Air Force is flying, and it's different from the B models, which have the vertical takeoff and landing capability that the Marines fly. However, it's bigger, it's faster, but the cockpit is the same, but it's a lot different. So this is the first cockpit which is all glass. There are no, some people call steam gauges or gauges that from the round dials, whatever you want to call them. There's not a whole lot in the cockpit in terms of switchology. It's all done on the 2 orange things on the left and right. So the F-35 was designed with a side stick, which is what the F-16s have. The throttle's on the left, the stick is on the right. You're wearing this really cool helmet that has all this information on it. And again, you can control everything with your hands and where you look. And on the panels in front of you, they're all configurable. I'm sure this is one that's been sanitized, but all your sensor information, all your weapons information, all the systems information on how the engine's doing, how much gas you got, where you are, all that kind of good stuff is all on those panels, which are eminently selectable. But to fly the airplane, because everything you have is in the head, so when you turn, unlike the F-18, when you're looking, the head's right there, but if you turn your head to go this way or that way to go look at something, your HUD basically follows you. And it has all the sensor information. So that the helmets have gone from the pretty simple things with just visors. Now it's one big giant computer, and the cost is now pretty substantial. But again, it makes it easier to fly because you're not forced to just focus on what's in front of you. So the question now becomes, is what drove this evolution? We now call it ergonomics. And so what brought us from the F4B4 to the F-35? Well, it's pretty simple when you look back on it from 2025 back to 1920. One, we suddenly added these things called radios, not only for navigation but for communications. The propulsion systems have changed. We've gone from fixed propellers to constant speed propellers to jet engines with afterburners. We've got on some airplanes like the F-22, there's variable thrust, all kinds of things in just controlling the engines. Then the sensors have changed. Back in the F4B4, it was just the Mark I eyeball. Now we've got radar, we've got electronic intelligence, we've got infrared, we got cameras. The F-35 provides a 360-degree view to the pilot of the cockpit from both sensor perspective and also using cameras that are high resolution. And then the weapon systems. If the F-4B4, you had two 30 caliber machine guns. You could see between your feet how much ammunition you had left. And that's all you had. Well, now you've got laser guided bombs, you got TV guided bombs, you got different kinds of missiles, it just goes on and on. So you got more weapons types, and the complexity of the weapons and employing them is a whole lot more complex, which leads you to the last thing, is tactics. Again, in the F4B4, it was see the other enemy, maneuver, get behind the enemy, shoot them down. Today, the tactics are a lot different. You see the enemy, hopefully on your sensors long before he sees you, and then you maneuver to control what they call the merge. But again, the tactics have changed because the weapons have changed. And then the other thing is the speed of the engagement has gone way up. So the F4B4, you're droning around, you're fighting at 150 knots unless you're in a dive. Airplane slows when you turn. In the F-35, you're a lot faster, and the airplane doesn't slow in a turn. It can maintain 1G going around a circle, and you're talking about 400, 500, 600 knots in the airplane, so things happen a lot faster, which means you need to react a lot faster. So that's the evolution of the cockpit. It's gone from something pretty simple, pretty basic, to something is actually pretty simple, pretty basic, but the presentation's a whole lot different. So thank you for watching. These are the 3 series of novels that I've written, and they're all available on a variety of different distributors. There's the Naval Aviator series at the top, Age of Sail series in the middle. That's the first 5 books of what will ultimately be 8 books. There's 3 counterterrorism novels and a standalone novel called The Red Star Death, which is about hunting Hezbollah terrorist. Again, thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel.